Our presenter, if you were here last week, you heard me say this again, but I want to welcome back for our second session, Dr. Steve Staggs. He holds his PhD and graduate certificate in ethnohistory from Western Michigan University. He is a historian of colonial North America. And his first book, he's working on his second, as he told us last week, but his first book is Calvinists and Indians in the Northeastern Woodlands. Dr. Staggs' research focuses on the interactions between indigenous African and European peoples in early modern Europe, colonial North America, and the North Atlantic world. So again, please join me in welcoming back Dr. Steve Staggs.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that introduction. It's good to be back with you this morning. Thanks for your presence here. It really means a lot to me. I'm looking forward to our time together. Really enjoyed our conversation we had at the end last week. I went home and couldn't stop talking to my wife and children about the conversation we had and how much fun it is to be with you. So thank you again for having me. I'd like to begin today by reminding us of the purpose or object of the course, these 4 sessions, remind you of the thesis, the conclusion that my working hypothesis for this project, and then get into today's session. So that's where I'd like to begin. So the object of the course, to remind you, is to explore how ideologies of race influence the ways in which early modern Calvinists of both African and European descent interpreted their Bibles, organized their institutions, and participated in the broader societies of the Dutch Atlantic world. In today's session, we will be analyzing and examining the way in which a Calvinist merchant in the service of the Dutch West India Company, you may remember last week, that was one of 2 mega corporations or joint stock trading companies that Dutch organized in the early modern period. But we're going to explore the way in which a Calvinist merchant in the service of the Dutch West India Company shifted the concept of race from one based on religious criteria to one defined by biological criteria. And he did this in 1704. And I hope to show why that's such a crucial time in what's happening in the transatlantic slave trade, that he writes that in 1704 is quite an important moment in time at the beginning of the 1700s, the 18th century. In the end of these sessions and the research that I'm working on, the working hypothesis that I have, in other words, what so far the sources are telling me, the conclusion I'm drawing, in other words, the object of the course, a thesis is the conclusion we make about the object. In the end, I propose, we are going to see that most Dutch Reformed church members, and by the way, it's important to note that Dutch Reformed church members are all over the Atlantic world, because there are Dutch colonies all over the Atlantic world. There are Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. There are Dutch colonies in the northern coast of South America. There are Dutch colonies in North America. There are Dutch outposts in West Central Africa. So, and of course, there are Dutch Reformed peoples in the Dutch Republic, but there are also Dutch Reformed peoples in England. So Dutch Reformed peoples are all around the Atlantic world. So bear that in mind. So in the end, I submit, we will see that most Dutch Reformed church members accepted and adopted the more rigid constructions of race being articulated by Dutch, English, and American naturalists and philosophers in the 18th century. And Willem Bosman, he wasn't a naturalist or philosopher, but his writing influences a lot of the writing of later peoples, as you're going to see today, who do consider themselves naturalists and philosophers. In fact, the end of today's session, again, I mentioned last week, I almost fell off the chair when I realized the influence Bosman had on a naturalist philosopher when I discovered the connection. In the end, that acceptance, the fact that Dutch Reformed Church members accepted and adopted those more rigid constructions of race, which are biological, in large part, I will argue, because of Bosman, justified their enslavement of Black people and the wealth it generated, which ultimately enabled the Dutch Reformed Church and many of its members to wield outside power and influence at the local, state, and federal levels, and thus contributed to the codification of racism in the early republic. So this entire project ends up in the United States, the early United States, and the way the Dutch Reformed Church was, and its members wielded outsourced power in the early United States and influenced the codification of racism in the United States, in its institutions, in its policies at the local, state, and federal level. So that's the conclusion of my working hypothesis. So today's session, exploring and analyzing the work of a Dutch Calvinist in the service of the Dutch West India Company. Now, as European colonies grew in both population and wealth, the chattel model became the predominant form of slavery in the Americas. Now, in the chattel model system of slavery, in that system, a human being claims ownership of another human being as property under the law. And what that meant was that enslaved humans had no rights and could be bought and sold like cattle. Indeed, that's where the word chattel comes from. As that violent, dehumanizing institution took root in the Americas, the agents of the transatlantic slave trade wrote letters to justify it. How are we going to justify this? In doing so, Europeans and Euro-Americans shifted the concept of race based on religious criteria to one defined by biological criteria, the color of one's skin. One of the most influential contributors to that change was a devout Calvinist named Willem Bosman. Born in Utrecht in 1672, Willem Bosman was only 16 years old when he arrived on the coast of Guinea, as you see on the slide. At the age of 16, Willem Bosman arrives on the Guinea coast of West Africa. When Bosman arrived in 1686, West Africa was undergoing significant changes at the time when he arrives. The previous year, 1685, the year before Bosman arrives, leaders of several local African groups approach the Prussian Brandenburg African Company. I'm going to use BAC for short because that's a mouthful. The Prussian, so the Prussians, right? That's the northern part of present-day Germany, Prussia, and parts of Poland. So at the time, Prussia was a state, and they had organized their own company the Brandenburg African Company. So in 1685, local African groups approach the Prussian Brandenburg African Company representatives, and now if you look at the map, at Cape 3 Points to request protection. So local African groups living in and around Cape 3 Points approach representatives of the Prussian Brandenburg African Company. And what are they asking for? They're asking for protection. From whom, though, you might ask? That's a good question. Who do they want protection from? They claimed that their Dutch and English allies had abandoned them. So they want protection from the Dutch and from the English. So the Dutch West India Company have representatives there, and so does the English Royal African Company have representatives there, the RAC. In exchange for Prussian military protection, these local African leaders promised to help finish the construction of Fort Great Fredericksburg without monetary pay. So there's the deal. You provide us military protection from the Dutch and the English. We will have our people help you finish constructing your fort, Fort Great Fredericksburg, at the Cape 3 Points. The Prussian Brandenburg African Company representatives accepted the deal. We accept. We will protect you from the Dutch and English. Will you help us? In exchange, you're going to help us finish building our fort here. These African Brandenburg alliances remade the political map of the Western Gold Coast. The Cape 3 Points is on what was called the Gold Coast in West Africa. And that alliance between the Brandenburg Company and the local African peoples remade the political map on the Gold Coast. Additionally, access to the trans-Saharan trade, you could remember, go up north on your mental map, there's the Saharan Desert. And across the Saharan Desert was a gold trade going on. So gold was coming down to the Western Gold Coast, hence Gold Coast. Access to the trans-Saharan trade to the north and the coastal European trade to the south was increasing the power, you could probably guess this, of the interior African peoples. Their power is increasing because they sit at the crossroads of that trans-Saharan trade. So their power is increasing. And these people included, and you can see them on the map, the Ashanti people's power is increasing. The Denkyera peoples, their power is increasing, and the Fanti peoples, their power is increasing in the period. As a result, now with what's a West India Company official to do? West India Company officials found it much more difficult to secure favorable trading conditions with their allies in West Africa. And that unnerved West India Company officials on the Gold Coast. They're unnerved. We're not getting as good of trade deals anymore. This is unnerving, and that's the context in which Willem Bosman arrives at the age of 16 in 1686. That's what's happening on the coast, on the Gold Coast when he arrives. West India Company officials had to curry favor of both the coastal African peoples and the interior African peoples. You have to curry favor, right? They're in a more dominant position than you, so you have to curry favor. The African peoples, both on the coast and in the interior, were both powerful enough to stop all trade in its tracks if they grew dissatisfied. You need to keep them satisfied. It reminds me very much of the situation in New Nederland between West India Company officials and Native Americans. You needed to keep your Native American neighbors satisfied, right? The operation of trade needed to be done on Native American terms. The same thing is true in West Africa. Locals took advantage, as you can see, of the Brandenburg African Company, the BAC presence at Cape Three Points, to negotiate better deals and treatment by Dutch and English traders. Again, in New Nederland, Native Americans did the same thing, right? The Haudenosaunee were masters of this. You use those, you got the French, the English, and the Dutch, so you play them off each other, and the Swedes. It's a similar situation here. The local African peoples on the coast know there are Prussians here, there are English here, there are Portuguese here, there are Spanish here, there are Dutch here. We can play them off and get good trade deals that favor us. More powerful African locals eagerly exploited the deep resentments between the members of the English Royal African Company and the Dutch West India Company officials. There was a deep resentment between the RAC representatives and the West India Company officials. The Dutch and English traders and officials in those companies didn't really care for one another. They're competitors, you see. Now there's Bosman on the left. When Bosman arrives, he arrives young, 16 years of age. He's ambitious, and he's a soldier. He's a West India Company soldier when he arrives at the age of 16. But soon, Willem Bosman begins rising through the ranks until he becomes the chief Dutch merchant on the Guinea coast. He's number 2. That's how high he's risen. He is number 2. The Opperkoopman, second in the hierarchy on the coast in the Dutch West India Company. He rises through the ranks to become the chief Dutch merchant on the Guinea coast. However, his careerism, his moralism, his moralistic, and his hypocrisy did not make him popular with others. Bosman looked down on those who drank and chased after women on the Guinea coast. Yet he sired at least one child with an African woman on the Guinea coast. In fact, to this day, there are several people in Ghana with the surname Bosman. To this day. Hypocrisy. Right? He's moralistic, yet right? He looks down on people chased after women, but he himself did the same. According to the testimony of 2 West India Company employees stationed in Accra in 1701, Bosman also sold 5 enslaved Africans to a Portuguese sailor and another to an Englishman from his own account. After this private transaction, the enslaved humans were smuggled aboard a ship, which made Bosman a tidy profit. Bosman was so unpopular that when the contract of the West India Company governor at Elmina, the first in command, was terminated in 1701. Remember, he's second, so he should get that position. So when the contract of the West India Company governor at Elmina was terminated in 1701, it was not the Hollander, Utrecht in Holland, the province of Holland. It was not the Hollander Bosman who succeeded him. That's how unpopular he was. He got passed over. Instead, the West India Company directors in Amsterdam appointed a Zeelander, Willem de la Palma, to the position. A former alderman in Middelburg, de la Palma had previously served the West India Company on the slave coast. So here's a map of the West African coast. The slave coast is further down the coast from the Gold Coast, and that's where De La Palma had previously served on the slave coast, not the Gold Coast. Elmina's on the Gold Coast, which you can see on this 18th century illustration from Bosman's book on this slide. When it came to business, Bosman and De La Palma differed. Perhaps it's where they served. De La Palma thought the slave trade ought to be the cornerstone of West India Company policy. Our policy should be built around the slave trade. Bosman vehemently disagreed. He thought the company could make more money in the gold trade, which is where he was serving the Gold Coast. Disillusioned by what he perceived to be inspiring,
Take a nap or so good together.
the conspiring and scheming of individuals who had it out for him, Bosman requested that he be released from his service on the coast of Guinea. Dismissed from his duties, the company obliged him. Dismissed from his duties, Bosman returned to the Dutch Republic. There's the Dutch Republic on the left. It's in the, is that a beige color? It's black and white, isn't it? So this is the Dutch Republic here. Bosman returned to the Dutch Republic. Shortly after he returned, the notary of Amsterdam recorded that he sold 11 pouches of gold. So upon his return, he first arrives in Amsterdam. Where does he go? He sells 11 pouches of gold. Bosman clearly profited from his time on the Gold Coast. Once settled back in his hometown of Utrecht, Bosman began writing. What did he write about? He wrote about his experiences on the Guinea coast. And in 1704, he published de nauwkeurige beschrijving van de Ghanese goud, hand in slaafkoest. It became an immediate bestseller. It became an immediate bestseller. And as you can see on this slide, was translated into both English on the left and French the very next year. Though we do not know much about the rest of his years in Utrecht, we do know that this book did well. In less than 30 years, Bosman's nauwkeurige beschrijving went through 5 editions. The royalties Bosman received from the sales of his book must have been substantial. It was also an international success, and to this day remains one of the most popular travelogues ever written in history. So let's dig into it. So part of the project is what I've been doing is reading the Dutch original translation, or the Dutch original, not the translations. I wanted to see what Dutch words he used, because things get lost in translation. So that's why you'll see me referring to the Dutch version, which is the one he wrote. So who did he dedicate the book to? Well, Bosman decided to dedicate the book to, quote, the most noble and honorable gentleman, the gecommitteerde bewindhebberen. Translation, the committed directors of the West India Company. And what did Bosman hope to do? What was the object of his book? What was the purpose? Well, he tells us. Bosman writes, he hoped to expose, quote, it's an expose. I hope to expose, quote, the evildoers pursuing their own interests and the irregularity of the West India Company administrators on the Guinea coast, end quote. Now, those directors who read the nauwkeurige beschrijving, the description of the coast of Guinea, discovered that it took the form of 20 letters. He wrote the book as letters addressed to his very good friend, Dr. Daniel Havard. You can see the arrow pointed there. There's Daniel Havard, his very good friend. Now, Daniel Havard was a doctor who had served as secretary and interpreter in the service of the Dutch East India Company, so out in the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean basin. And more specifically, Dr. Daniel Havard served as secretary and interpreter on the southeast coast of India, and then became a surgeon in the service of the West India Company, where? On the Gold Coast, where Bosman had served. At the outset of the negende, or ninth, which I'm showing you here, there's the Dutch original, the negende brief in Dutch is letter, so forms of letters. So at the outset of the negende ninth letter, Bosman identified the inboorlingen, natives, that's the Dutch word natives, inboorlingen, natives, by what? How did he identify them? By the color of their skin. He equated Africans with blackness. And he explains it. Bosman explained to his readers that he used the word Negroes to identify the peoples of West Africa because the word neger, that's a Dutch word, or nigger, meant zwart. And zwart in Dutch means black. Maybe you know some Dutch people with the surname Zwart. Zwart is black. So at the outset, Bosman explains to his readers, I used the word Negro or Negroes to identify the peoples of West Africa because the word neger or nigger meant zwart, black, and negers were clearly zwart. They were clearly blacks. Having done that equation, Africans equals black, blackness. He went on then to describe their aangeboren aard, the inborn nature of black people. According to Bosman in the ninth letter, blacks were born and raised in a stinky environment. They stink. By nature, blacks are hypersexual. They are dishonest and deceitful. They are, he continued, a lazy carefree, and devilishly stingy race who love strong drink. And they put no care into the construction of their villages. They put no care into the construction of their homes. They put no care into the construction of their roads. As for their parenting and their religion, Bosman characterized Blacks as bad parents. In terms of religion, they are dumb Gentiles. They're dumb. In sum, Bosman asserted in his letter, in the book, that Blacks were inferior to the Blanken, the whites. In his 10th letter, the subsequent letter, the tiende brief, he then explained to his readers the roots of Black inferiority. And it's interesting where he finds the roots of their inferiority. He finds it, he argues, in their own origin story. They themselves tell an origin story that reflects their inferiority. According to Bosman, most of the Africans living on the Guinea coast believed in the one true God, who, in the beginning, created two races of people, Black people and white people. In doing so, Bosman noted, they tried to prove that Black people were present at the beginning, just like white people. Now I'm going to quote Bosman here. To give themselves even more honor, Bosman continued, they also believed that God offered them a gift in the beginning. Black people offered them a gift at creation. They could choose either gold or they could choose the art of learning and writing. And God gave the Blacks the first choice, not the white people, but the Black people get to choose first. Which do you want? Do you want gold or do you want the art of learning and writing? Bosman goes on, the Black people chose gold and they left literature to white people. God, according to Bosman, was so disturbed by their lust, by their greed for mammon, that he decided then and there that whites should rule over Blacks for eternity, and that Blacks should always serve whites. This then is how Bosman justified the enslavement of African peoples, because he claims it's in their own origin story. Now, Bosman was certainly not the first European to articulate racist ideas. That's not what I'm saying. He's not the first. As historian Ibram X. Kendi so compellingly chronicled in his award-winning book, Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which was published in 2016. I recommend it. It's a big read, but it is accessible. And again, it's an intellectual history of ideas. As historian Ibram X. Kendi or Kendi, so compellingly chronicled in his award-winning book, Stamped from the Beginning, the idea that African slavery was natural, that it was more normal, and that it was holy was quite an old racist idea by the time Bosman wrote a description of the Guinea coast. That was an old idea, that slavery was natural, normal, and holy. In fact, in 1452, the King of Portugal commissioned Gomes Yanes de Zurara to write a biography of Prince Henry. On the right of the slide is a purported image of Prince Henry, the navigator. On the left is the title of the work in Portuguese and then the English translation, Chronicle of the Deeds of Guinea. In 1452, the King of Portugal commissioned Zurara to write a biography of Prince Henry, the king's uncle, the King of Portugal's uncle. A year later, Zurara completed his chronicle, which, as Kendi writes, begins the recorded history of racist ideas. So Kendi points to 1453. 1453, according to Kendi, is the start of the history of racist ideas. It begins in 1453, Kendi argues. As with Bosman, Zurara's racist ideas were a product of racial policies. Sometimes it's thought to go the other way around, that racial ideas then lead to racial policies. Kendi and historians like myself argue, no, it's the other way around. You have the racist policies, which leads to the racist ideas to then justify those policies. In 1444, 6 Portuguese ships arrived in the port of Lisbon with 240 African captives. Prince Henry himself oversaw a very public slave auction on the outskirts of Lisbon. During the auction, Henry selected 46 of the most valuable humans on offer. How's Zurara going to defend that? Right, because this biography is supposed to celebrate Prince Henry. Zurara, in his chronicle, defended Prince Henry's actions, selecting 46 of the most valuable humans on offer at that slave auction. Zurara defended those actions by arguing that the enslavement of these Africans would result in the salvation of their souls. You see religious criteria. And Zurara said, otherwise their souls would be lost. Under serving Prince Henry, they will become good Christians. Their souls will be saved. To support his evangelical justification, Zurara described the African captives as a people who, quote, lived like beasts without custom of reasonable beings, end quote. Zurara continued, quote, they have no knowledge of bread or wine, and they were without covering of clothes or the lodgment of houses, and worse than all, they had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth, end quote. Although his chronicle only circulated among the elite, Zurara's ideas circulated far and wide as Portuguese expanded their slave trading network further south along the West African coast. Consequently, the Portuguese became the primary source knowledge regarding sub-Saharan Africa and Africans for the earliest slave traders and the enslavers of Spain, France, England, and the Dutch Republic. Not surprisingly, similar evangelical justifications and religious constructions of race would subsequently be published, including, and I'll point out a couple more notable ones, including the Cosmographia et Geographia de Africa on the left there, which was written by the Arab Andalusian diplomat Leo Africanus in 1526 and was subsequently published in English in 1600. The Brevissima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, a brief account of the destruction of the Indies, which was published, it's on the right there, which was published by the Spanish Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas in 1552. A true and exact history of the island of Barbados, which was published by the English planter Richard Ligon in 1657. And on the right, A Good Master Well Served, which was published, if you've found it already, by Cotton Mather, the Puritan pastor of the Congregationalist Old North Meeting House in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, what set Bosman's nauwkeurige beschrijving apart from previous pro-slavery works, like the ones I just mentioned, was that he grounded racial difference in biology, not theology, first and foremost. It was grounded in biology. He equated Blackness with people of African ancestry. In doing so, he created an immediately obvious difference, an immediately obvious line to demarcate the difference between the people who would be enslaved and those who would not. A clear line. Those who could not be enslaved were the Blanken, the whites. These were people who had no ancestors of color, Bosman argued, and so they could not be enslaved. These concepts, the idea of Blackness and the idea of whiteness, would be used to justify the chattel model of slavery and arrange power in ways that would benefit the white elite in the 18th century world, the 18th century Atlantic world. These concepts, the idea of Blackness and whiteness, would be used to justify chattel slavery and arrange power in ways that would benefit white people, the white elite in particular, in the 18th century Atlantic world. Beyond their substance, the other feature differentiating Bosman's racist ideas were the extent and timing of their reach. The extent of the reach of this work and the timing of it. By the time nauwkeurige beschrijving was published in 1704, the people who were producing and buying books had drastically changed. Think about that. It's 1704. What has happened in the world to lead to the change in the people who are producing and buying books by 1704? It had drastically changed. Demand from cities and universities drove the growth of the book industry in the early modern period in Europe. A mass market for books grew throughout Western Europe, especially in the Protestant countries of Great Britain, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic. The level of book consumption was likely much higher than in China, Korea, and Japan, the other centers of printing in the world at the time. Although merchants and professionals were the primary consumers of books, books by 1704 had come within the reach of the lower middle classes during the early modern period. I can show you. Somebody has done research on this and put together this great graph. As you can see on this slide, literacy rates reflect the growth of a reading public. By 1701, 3 years before the publication of Bosman's book, the overall literacy rate in Western Europe was 31%. In the Dutch Republic, now let's dig into that a little more. In the Dutch Republic, wait for it, 85% of the population was literate in the Dutch Republic in 1701, 85% of the population were literate. While the literacy rates for Great Britain, Sweden, and Germany were 54% for Great Britain, 48% for Sweden, and 38% for the German states. Germany wasn't a nation yet. Bosman's writing style appealed to this broad, burgeoning audience. Bosman didn't write for the elite. Bosman wrote for the ordinary person. In addition, he did not presume, as many academics do, by the way, he did not presume his readers possessed prior knowledge of his subject, even though, as you can see from this slide, the general outline of the map of the world was relatively well known by the time he published his book. For example, I'll give you an example of him not assuming prior knowledge of his readers and why he's trying to reach a big audience, right? By not making that assumption. For example, in the nauwkeurige beschrijving, he pointed out, quote, that the coast of Guinea is a part of Africa and not of the West Indies. As some think, by the way, West Indies, Caribbean, right? So he's pointing out, right, the Guinea coast is not in the Caribbean, as some people think. It's West Africa, the West Africa. So he's clarifying. Again, even though most people had a general idea of the outline of the world, he's just, I don't want to assume you think the Guinea coast is in West Africa, but it is. By the way, why did some people think that? Well, he actually explained that going on, quote, because the West Indies are in America. And therefore an entirely different world, end quote, right? So he wants to be abundantly clear what he's about to describe is not a coastline in the Caribbean or in South America or in West Africa. Offering readers with an accessible detail, he is very detailed, eyewitness account, right? So he said, I lived there. I saw this with my very own eyes. He offers his readers an accessible, eyewitness, detailed account of the coast of Guinea, and that proved really, really popular. West Africa was a region of the world that European and Euro-American readers were increasingly interested in. Why might that be? Part of the reason is that transatlantic slave trade was bringing more and more Africans to the shores of Europe and the Americas. So there now are people, and you're beginning to see them more and more from Africa living in Europe and in the Americas. So people are interested in learning more about where these people come from and what are they like. The reach and popularity of Bosman's accurate description provided new ammunition for those looking, and they were looking, to justify the chattel model of slavery in the Americas. In fact, Bosman's racist ideas, I'm going to now mention someone who was looking for justification. Remember, I mentioned at the outset, naturalists and philosophers looking to justify this model. In fact, Bosman's racist ideas would be echoed by none other than Thomas Jefferson. 83 years later, in his notes on the state of Virginia, there it is on the left. That's the 1786 publication. Notice it's in French. English translation notes on the state of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson wrote the notes to respond to a questionnaire presented to officials of the 13 states by the secretary of the French delegation in Philadelphia in 1780. So the 13 United States received a delegation from France. The secretary of that French delegation brought a questionnaire, presented it to leaders of the different 13 states. It asked for a response. The French are interested in learning more about each of these states, this new republic. They want to learn more. Jefferson sat down to answer the questionnaire about Virginia, of course. That's where he's from. His first response was completed in 1781. In 1781, Jefferson, you might know, was the governor of Virginia, so it might make sense that he would fill out the questionnaire and respond to the questions that the French delegation had. Then in 1782, he updated that first version, and then in 1783, updated it again. He had some edits to make, some things to add. So 81, 82, 83, Jefferson is writing a response to the questionnaire. The first edition of the Notes on the State of Virginia was anonymously published in 1785. Published. This was a questionnaire. And someone anonymously decides, ooh, let's publish this. In French, of course, as you see. In that edition, the 1785, then as you see here, 86 edition, Jefferson asserted that blacks were, quote, inferior to whites in the endowments of both body and mind, end quote. Jefferson then goes on in his notes on the state of Virginia to present a lengthy list of black attributes, strikingly similar to those set forth by Bosman. As I read it, wait a second, this sounds really familiar. Blacks, Jefferson argued, are asensual, hypersexual, Bosman. They're irrational. They're not reasonable beings. They're unimaginative. And they're short-sighted. They don't think about the conditions of their houses, their roads, how to organize their villages. And, according to Jefferson, black people also produce a strong disagreeable odor. The fact that Jefferson's description of black people mirrored and echoed that of Bosman's, as it turns out, is not that surprising. After conducting a search of Jefferson's 260-page catalog of the books in his library circa 1783, I discovered, and there you can see it in his own handwriting, that he owned a copy of the French edition of Bosman's accurate description of the Guinea coast. There on page 164 of his catalog, Jefferson recorded the French title. He had it on a shelf in his library. There, recorded in his handwriting, is the French title, Voyage de Guinée de Bosman. That was the French edition. As you know, Jefferson was fluent in French. He could read it. He didn't need the English copy. He could read the French. In 1788, and this is important for where we're going 2 sessions from now, so tuck this one in the back of your mind. In 1788, 5 years, and there it is on the left, in 1788, 5 years after cataloging his library collection, an English edition of Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia was published in Philadelphia, in the North, and was widely circulated in the North, in the northern states. People gobbled it up. It was popular in northern states. 1788, don't forget that date, because something significant happens as that's circulating up in the North that we'll get to. So I think that's important to note for where we're going with our story. Oh, I don't have my glasses. I have to check the time. Are we doing our time? Okay, 15 minutes. Oh, this is we're right where I was hoping we would be. When telling, let's see. Yes, that's what I want. When telling and retelling the story of the transatlantic slave trade, white Dutch historians developed a script that whitewashed the past. These books you're looking at, they're contemporary books. These were written in the mid to late 20th century, these books. So I'm going to repeat that because it connects to this idea I mentioned last time about silencing the past and this gaping hole. Because I expected, right, when I read that letter by Peter Lowe, that I would find that there are Dutch historians who've written about Dutch racism, justification of slavery, and I didn't find it. In fact, the only book I found that tackled and took on the idea of Dutch racism was a book with the title Dutch Racism. But you may have guessed, the book is a collection of essays written by non-white Dutch sociologists. Wrote that book and basically say white Dutch people do not acknowledge their racism today, nor in the past. And we need to begin dealing with that. And they are Dutch themselves, but they're not white Dutch, right? These are Dutch people whose ancestry were enslaved in the Dutch Caribbean or South America, Suriname, or they're Indo-Dutch. They were oppressed by the Dutch in Indonesia. And they are now Dutch citizens, scholars, and they wrote this book, Dutch Racism. When telling and retelling the story of the transatlantic slave trade, white Dutch historians developed a script that whitewashed the past. As a result, the Dutch master narrative focuses on trade rather than the enslavement and racism involved. It focuses on trade rather than enslavement and racism. Even the concept, which you may have been wondering about, you keep using the word enslavement and not slavery. You'll notice once in a while I'll use it. But this concept of enslavement, that word, I'm using it deliberately. Even that concept of enslavement, by the way, using that word, when we use it, we acknowledge the fact that slavery was imposed on humans. When you use that word, enslavement, you were acknowledging the fact that slavery was imposed on human beings who resisted their captivity. Right? That word fights against the stereotype that Africans just accepted to slave. Oh, well, I'm now enslaved. It acknowledges the fact that slavery was imposed and that those humans resisted their captivity. Even that concept, the concept of enslavement, is still in the Dutch Republic, in the Netherlands. It is still struggling to gain acceptance in the Dutch lexicon, despite the efforts of those in the Afro-Dutch community, because they are using it in the Netherlands. But they're having a hard time getting their white Dutch counterparts to use the word enslavement. And they're trying to make that argument, we should use that word. When you do, you acknowledge that enslavement was imposed on our ancestors. We haven't forgotten. And our ancestors resisted that captivity too. You acknowledge that when you use that word. But even that concept is struggling to gain acceptance in the Netherlands. I think in the United States, we're a bit farther in using it, that word in the United States, than the Dutch are. Not to say that all Americans use the word enslavement, but we're getting there, I think. Among many historians, it's the accepted term to use, at the very least. By focusing, now back to the white Dutch historians, by focusing on the trade, on profits and losses of the Dutch West India Company, right? That's a comfortable place to go, right? Let's look at the numbers, like the bottom line, let's check out, right? Were they making a profit? Were they making a loss in this year? By focusing on the profits and losses of the Dutch West India Company, the Dutch master narrative implicitly accepts that slavery was a legitimate business. If that's what you're going to do, you were implicitly accepting that was a legitimate business. Prominent Dutch historians have argued that the pursuit of profit, listen to this, prominent, I mean, these are not, right? Prominent, leading Dutch historians, white Dutch historians, have argued that the pursuit of promise ensured relatively good, humane treatment of enslaved Africans while crossing the Atlantic. That's their argument. Because the Dutch were so focused on profit, right, they treated their slaves more humanely than the Spanish did, the English did, the Portuguese, the French, etc., the Prussians. In doing that, they uncritically accept the notion advanced by Bosman, don't you see? The Dutch Calvinist enslaver, who in 1704 wrote that very argument in his book, quoting, you really wonder, this is now Bosman in the book, nauwkeurige beschrijving, quote, you really wonder to see how these slaves live on board. For though their number sometimes amounts to 600 or 700 on one ship, yet by the careful management of our masters of ships, they are so regulated that it seems incredible. And in this particular, our nation exceeds all other Europeans. For as the French, Portuguese, and English slave ships are always foul and stinking, on the contrary, ours are for the most part clean and neat, right? Leaning into that Dutch stereotype of cleanliness. We are a clean people. End quote. So you see, they are accepting that argument that Bosman makes. At least when we participated, we were more humane in our treatment than others. The idea that the Dutch were cleaner and more caring, more humane and tolerant. By the way, that's another Dutch stereotype. The Dutch are tolerant people. The idea that the Dutch, right, this leans into all the Dutch stereotypes, that they're cleaner, more caring, humane, and tolerant than their European competitors, legitimize their enslavement of African people. And it also served to reinforce Dutch exceptionalism. The belief, still prevalent in the Netherlands to this day, that the Netherlands is a colorblind or non-racist nation. We are not racists. I experienced this myself living in Amsterdam because I attended the Intocht. The Intocht is when Sinterklaas comes aboard the steamship into town. I was living in Amsterdam, so I went to attend and see what this is all about, the Intocht. And to my shock and horror, I'm walking around Amsterdam, and all of a sudden there are white Dutch people in blackface coming off of buildings. They're everywhere. Zwarte Pieten, Black Pete's, Sinterklaas's helpers. I was stunned. What is happening? Where am I? The next day, the very next day, I got the Dutch newspaper, and the Dutch newspaper, De Telegraaf, was boasting that we broke a record in Amsterdam. We had 450 white Dutch people in blackface. They didn't put it that way. We had 450 Zwarte Pieten all across the city. The evening, by the way, after the Intocht, I asked my Dutch flatmates, we were having dinner, and I said, because they had gone too, I said, does that strike you as racist? And you'd think I was from another planet. They looked at me mind-boggled. Racist? We're not a racist country. We're colorblind. That's part of our traditions. Yeah. Right? That master narrative that whitewashes the past reinforces Dutch exceptionalism, the belief that the Netherlands is a colorblind, non-racist nation. But here's the thing. The enslaved and their descendants did not forget about slavery, about their ancestors' enslavement. And they have not forgotten the racism that justified it. But what they live in a society where there is a widespread silence surrounding the topic. That silence, in fact, grew following the abolition of slavery in Suriname and the Dutch colonies in the Caribbean on July 1, 1863. 1863, the Dutch abolished slavery in their colony of Suriname and their colonies in the Caribbean. In fact, it wasn't until last year, at an event to commemorate the anniversary of the abolition of slavery, that the King of the Netherlands, Willem-Alexander, there he is on the right, finally issued a formal apology for his country's role in slavery and asked, quote, for forgiveness for the clear failure to act in the face of this crime against humanity, end quote. The goal of this course then, as I laid out at the beginning, so we're now back to where we started, is to interrogate that master narrative and to unsilence this past. In next week's session, I'm going to show how Jacobus Elias Johannes Kapitein, the first person of African descent ordained as a minister in an Orthodox Protestant denomination, challenged the enslavement of Africans in 1742. So now we're going to move 40 years plus ahead. Oh, a little less than 40 next week. and we will explore the ways in which Jacobus Kapitein, enslaved by Dutch West India Company Admiral, challenges enslavement in 1742. Interestingly enough, by the way, contemporaries and still to this day, many historians don't think he was challenging enslavement. In fact, that he was supporting enslavement of Africans. I beg to differ. I disagree, and I'll explain why I disagree with that assessment next week. Any questions, thoughts? We have Steve has the microphone.
One thing first about black peat. When I was a little girl, the Dutch people around here were teaching you that black peat puts coal in your stocking. That's your punishment. It's not black peat is this happy little black assistant who's going to put an extra present in your stocking. It's darker than that.
And he
It's-
whips you.
It's really.
If you're on the naughty list, you will get a whipping from
Now,
black
is
peat.
is that still the modern Dutch understanding of black peat? Or
So-
has black peat turned into a little decoration in the sleigh because it's cute or something?
Oh, very interesting thing that you mentioned there, that idea of the coal. So today, this has now become a debate, an open debate in the Netherlands. I will tell you that the majority still want to defend that tradition and Zwarte Piet. That's where the majority live. Now, there is beginning to raise up a vocal minority, some of whom are white Dutch. But I followed this debate because when following that debate, the primary argument now made by those who want to defend the tradition is to say it's not blackface. The Dutch are sensitive enough to realize that, oh, in the United States, blackface, that's taboo. You don't do that anymore. You can get in trouble for that. So now the explanation, it is not blackface. Now, we're not trying to make ourselves black with blackface. Zwarte Piet is zwart because he goes down a chimney. So it's soot from the chimney. And that's why we put the blackface on, because to represent the soot that Zwarte Piet gets all over himself when he goes down chimneys. And you can imagine at a night, an entire evening and going through the Netherlands and all the Dutch kingdom of the Netherlands, putting gifts in wooden shoes, that you're going to look black by the end. So that is the current defense now. So there is still a defense to defend that tradition that David Sedaris, by the way, if you like comedy, David Sedaris, who's a comedian, a very insightful comedian, has an entire piece on when he realized this tradition. And he does a whole comedy sketch. He's written it out that is, I find hilarious. Like he was shocked like I was, and he's just had to put it into a comedy piece about the Dutch tradition of the Zwarte Piet. If you want a comedic take on that whole tradition.
This is probably really a topic for a whole nother something or other, but if during the heavy slave trade and blacks from Africa were also being sold into Europe, so to speak,
Mhm.
we don't hear about the kind of discrimination problems in Europe that the US and Africa have had. And I guess my question is why?
That's good question. I'll refer you to one of my mentors, John Salant, has written about that. And there are other scholars who have written about the African experience in Europe, being brought to Europe. In this period that we're looking at, and I'm going to get into this in this next session of in this period, what European nations are doing in restricting slavery in Europe, not in their colonies, but in Europe, but they'll justifying it in their colonies. So there are scholars who have written about the African experience in Europe. In the next week's session, I'm going to get into one African's experience in Den Haag, in The Hague, Jacobus Kapitein. So he lived and experienced what it was like. So I'll share about his experience of what it was like there. I think part of why, right, being in the United States and a lot of the scholarship that's being done recently is to focus our attention in the United States on the difference of the slave model used in the Americas than in Europe. There's a different model of slavery. And the real focus recently has been on chattel model of slavery that develops in this time that we're talking about in the 1700s, that gets deeply rooted in the Americas, and eventually then it becomes called the peculiar institution of the United States. So a lot of scholarship is focused there.
So what you're really saying is Europe didn't necessarily follow the channel line.
Yeah. Oh, this last one? Yeah, the difference being in what scholars have explored when comparing models of slavery and then there's been a lot written. John Thornton, by the way, is a really good scholar in this, on the model of slavery that existed in Africa, and the model of slavery in Europe, and how this chattel model that develops in the Americas in the 1700s and becomes institutionalized in the United States by law, and black codes, which I'm going to get to in the final presentation, actually. That's what the comment was about, focusing on those differences in models of slavery.
I think you introduced yourself as a Dutch Calvinist Christian. Is that
Bosman,
you personally?
me.
Yeah.
Yeah, last week I was raised in the Reformed tradition. I was raised in the Protestant Reformed Church.
Were you ever tempted to quit? This is so painful. This is such a mark on our history. What was your personal reaction, and were you ever tempted to, this is too painful, too personal, I have to set this aside?
In terms of feeling belonging to that Reformed
Your
institution.
personal
personally?
reaction to.
Oh. Yeah, so personally, in my own life story, there was a lot there. In fact, recently when my wife and I got together with the new pastors of our church who were younger, they wanted to get to know us a bit because my wife and I and our children have experienced in the last 5 years quite a number of being rejected by Christian institutions, particularly Dutch Reformed institutions, and the pain of that. That also goes back to my childhood, when my mom and dad decided to put my sister, who's younger, into a Christian Reformed day school. She was in the Protestant Reformed day school, but was being teased mercilessly by her cousins of all people, and got to the point where she literally would be sick in the morning, wouldn't want to go to school. She was little. She was third grade at the time. So they decided to move her to the Christian Reformed day school in town. And for a year then, elders came to our home to talk to my parents, and eventually put them under excommunication. My brother and I listened one night because we're like, why are the elders coming all the time? And we heard the elders say to my parents, if you don't move your daughter back to our day school, you may end up going to heaven, but your children will go to hell. And my brother and I looked at each other, oh no, we got to talk to mom and dad. So they're in our family, and then my own family now too, there's been a lot of pain about feeling rejection. And so when we met with those pastors recently and shared a bit of our story, and that we've remained in that church, it's a Christian Reformed church that's actually leaving the Christian Reformed church. So in some sense, we are leaving now because the church has decided to leave after the recent synod decision about homosexuality, which that too is very personal to us and our family. And so they said, after listening to us, they asked us that very same question: how are you still members? And my answer to that was simply, it's because mentally what my wife and I have been able to do is to recognize there are institutions, and then there's God and Jesus Christ, right? And our faith in God and Jesus Christ as our anchor, our trust and our hope, that's not diminished. Our faith in the institutions we were raised in and the hurt and rejection we felt in those institutions, that's painful and that really hurts. So I answered this last week, for me, it is very personal. And I also feel an obligation to God that I'm called by my faith to do this kind of work in history, that this is activism, to raise awareness. People in that tradition, and how much power our institutions, especially in the late 1700s, 1800s, in the United States had. It's important for us to recognize and be aware of it because, again, it's been silenced. I didn't know it. I was not taught any of this in the day school, high school, the college I went to Calvin, wasn't taught any of this. It was until I had discovered this that, oh my word, why have I not been told this? And one reaction to that I've gotten, I distinctly remember this reaction from a student when I was teaching US history. I taught it as a seminar and we had conversation. At one point in our conversation, the student sitting right next to me stopped and said to me, to the class, aren't you concerned that we're going to become disillusioned about our country, the United States? And I paused a moment. I said, what does the word disillusion mean? What does that mean? Think about it. Because we often think of that, that's a bad thing. To be disillusioned is a negative thing. So what does it mean? And then she thought about it, said, oh, our illusions, the myths that we are told, as James Lewin puts it, the lies we're told about US history, we're seeing more clearly now. We've become disillusioned. We've grown up. We can handle the difficult stuff, right? That's a part of the story too. And we shouldn't just ignore it, but we should be aware of it. And that's where Jamar Tisby and others, and myself included, the professor who was my mentor at Calvin, who just retired, William Van Vugt, that was part of why he did history too, was you're raising awareness, and in doing that, you're hoping to bring or take a step toward reconciliation and justice. And as I mentioned last week, when conversations like recently came up, Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, right? When conversations about reparations come up, not to just knee-jerk, well, that's a stupid idea, but to listen and maybe think, maybe there's something there. I want to listen and learn and understand because I'm aware of the past. So that raised awareness might lead me to think a little bit more about such ideas and proposals.
There will be consequences when you publish this book, will there not?
I talked about that last week. Yes.
Negative consequences.
Yes. When I first presented a paper on this research, when I first had gotten started, I had enough and was convinced by my Dutch professor at Calvin. He said, you should write, I know you're doing a lot of work, just put something about education. We're going to do a conference on education. You can read that paper, by the way. It was published by Van Raalte Press about Dutch Reformed education. The article's in there. But I presented that at Detroit Country Day High School out in Detroit. The history professor there puts on an annual Jefferson lecture, and he invited me. I don't know how he got my name. An email popped up in my inbox, said, we'd like to invite you to be our Jefferson lecturer this year. Will you accept? And I immediately thought of what I had discovered that summer about Boseman's connection to Jefferson. I said, I'll do it. And I presented, and I had a number of people come up afterwards. I'm getting to your point. The person waiting in the wings the longest finally comes up. He was a young African-American man. He happened to be, he teaches middle school horns there at Detroit Country Day. And he came up and we talked for a while. He introduced himself. He said, this is really important what you're doing. But he said, I'm going to be praying for you because this is dangerous, what you're doing. Right? He gets it, right? Putting this out there is a dangerous thing to do. And I talked about that last week, the consequences that comes with unsilencing the past. There are consequences that occur.
This becomes an unmasking, I guess, about institutions that claim to define for themselves and others who is in and who is out, who is going to hell, who is going to heaven. The CRC right now is losing a lot of very intelligent leaders because they can't keep going on the route that their institution is beginning to take.
Mm-hmm.
There is power in being able to decide who is in and who is out. And people are more enamored of power, and that's the mammon,
Mm-hmm.
the power. And people who question it are Well, they want to be, the institutions want to silence those who are asking questions. The history department at Calvin College, there are financial problems and many other problems, but it is greatly diminished. The humanities in higher education are being lost out because people are following, you need to prepare for a career that will get you wealthy rather than improve your mind. So I can understand why there's a lot of hostility here, because so many people are tied to the notions of saving people from hell. And now a lot of people are questioning a lot of former missionary activity of our own denomination and sister denominations and others in the Protestant and Catholic world. How much of our missionary activity is really a form of colonialism, a form of deciding who's in and who's out, and it's a lack of humility. It's ungodly.
I appreciate you mentioning that, Judy. By the way, I also want to just highlight something Judy sent me over email, which is worth it though. Well, we got an hour before it happens, but happen to be a member of the Netherlands America Foundation. One of the historians who's done some really important work in and around Brooklyn, history of Brooklyn, and in particular the African American experience in Brooklyn historically to the present, is Craig Wilder. He's got some really important books. He's presenting actually at noon digitally through the Northern America Foundation, which I'm looking forward to. By the way, I mentioned them too because I'm beholden to them and really appreciate them, because they were the ones who funded my Fulbright grant, the 500 New York History Fulbright grant that led to a lot of the research that I did for my first book. They were also then, when I came back to them when I was ready to publish and had 42 images I wanted to publish, but the publisher said, well, that's expensive. You need to find money. We'll do it, but you got to find money. The NAF gave me a grant to cover publishing of the images in that book. So I'm really grateful to them. And that's an important presentation today that Craig Wilder's presenting. But yeah, Judy's comment is very, very true. And it is a real concern that I have. I share that concern that Judy has about where the humanities are in the United States and history departments and what's going on.
I think we've reached the conclusion of our time. I would encourage you, if you do have more questions of Dr. Staggs, if you're around for a few minutes. I know I have one that I just need to check for accuracy. So in any event, thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Oh, I remembered one more thing, if I may.
Yeah.
This is really exciting. So and this gets to a lot of what your name is, sir? What Dave and Judy were commenting on. Tonight, I don't know, you maybe know this already, I believe it's 7 o'clock at the Knickerbocker Theater. Kristen Dumais and a director, they're premiering a work for our daughters. If you don't know Kristen Dumais is in Calvin's history department. If you're not, Kristen Dumais, Jesus on John Wayne. If you want to understand how we got to our present moment in our politics and why so many Christians support Trump, her argument in the book is it's not because Christian evangelicals held their nose and voted for Trump. It was, no, Christian evangelicals were excited to vote for Trump. And she explains why that is. She goes back to the 1960s and takes you forward to explain how that happened and why that is. So if you're wanting to understand that, that is an outstanding book. Anyone who listens, I recommend that book too. I gave it to my mom to read, and friends and family, like, you got to read Jesus and John Wayne. I explained so much of my own childhood. I'm like, oh my word, like my mom and dad had that book. So anyway, for our daughters tonight at the Knickerbocker Theater, I'm going to try to convince my wife to go. I haven't seen it yet. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I just needed to plug that because that.
Thank you. All right. We'll see you next week.
I saw your email.